We're doing more appraisals today in this little town with a lot of big-hearted people who are dedicated to preserving history. We're going to take a quick look inside 3 of their various museum buildings, in between doing appraisals of all sorts of interesting things. First, we're going to find out just a little bit more about the people who brought this town to prominence.
The Dezells came here from Chicago, and there is Mrs. Lila Dezell in the back, second from the left, sporting a really great hat. This is Mrs. Dezell's wedding dress. Isn't that sweet and beautiful? And look at the color. And there's her hanky and even the wedding invitation. This is going to be from about 1890. Pump organs were the entertainment in a lot of houses, and you typically had one in the 1890s. This is a nice Mason and Hamlin. And then there's this very nice bedroom suite here, and the child's crib with the little quilts and the applique with the Sunbonnet Sue. This is a nice older quilt as well, actually an applique with quilting in the background. When the 1920s came and they had some money, well, the little black dress came into style, and the little black dress had to be accessorized, and so Eisenberg came with the idea of making these kind of costume jewelry pins because they were tired of the pins getting stolen off of their dresses. That's how Eisenberg became a jewelry maker. Cute little cape there. You have your luggage all ready and packed and ready to go. And of course you have a corset. It's very important. Women were supposed to corset to get that perfect figure. It's why women passed out a lot and had to have smelling salts. It was beauty at a price. I like the displays because they're informative. You know, we didn't have Kleenex. You had to have a handkerchief. And I did not know this little fact that children were required to bring a clean kerchief to school every day because people didn't have the ability to do laundry every day. Nice 1890s marble top, actually probably 1880s with these wooden escutcheons. Beautiful marble top chest of drawers here. And the nice vanity here. So it's just a very sweet place to tour, and I'm really enjoying being here. And we're going to look at some more stuff now. I like looking at everything from, you know, something that's worth $5, but it means a lot to you because mom and dad had it, to the Holy Grail. So, yeah. Oh, you got that with you? Oh, good, good. I was hoping that would come in today.
They were given to me by a friend, and her father was lifelong military. And she thought that they picked them up in Turkey.
I believe that is the case, particularly this fellow here because he's holding something that looks like a scimitar. And just the nature of the folk dress. These are all hand painted and they are watercolors. And they're various folk traditions, as you see, and she took one out so that I could see it a little better, which is great, so I can see the type of paper it's done on. One of them is signed, this particular one here. It's not a signature of an artist that we can trace or would know in our society. We were for tourists and people who were living there for a short period of time. The people living there, this is their old tradition, but they live around it all the time, and they don't find it as fascinating as the people coming from outside. A lot of Westerners, a lot of Americans started to be stationed in Turkey in the 1950s and on. Just loose, I know you put them in frames, which is a good thing to preserve them. I would estimate that these would sell for maybe $35 to $45 each, so you're probably looking at $135 to $150 for the collection, I think would be about right.
All we know about this is somebody gave it to my grandmother in the 1920s. They lived in a very old house. They were old people, and said to Nana, come and pick out anything you want. And that's what she chose.
Oh, how neat. She picked this.
Because
she could carry it, so she picked this. Well, that was smart because actually she was onto something, because people nowadays are more interested in little furniture than big furniture, because the little furniture, if they want to rearrange or clean under it, they can move it themselves. And the big stuff, well, that's a little bit harder. This is what they call a tilt top table, or in England, a loo table. And the purpose of this was that you could actually clip it in, put the hook underneath it, and then this isn't going anywhere, and you have a nice solid surface. but you could tip it up this way when you weren't using it. And you think, well, why would you want to tip the table up when you weren't using it? Well, there's a few reasons. One might be limited space in a house. But at least equally likely was that some of these, when they were not serving duty as tables, were put between a woman and the fireplace, because makeup in the early and mid 1800s was mainly made with a beeswax base. And if you didn't have a screen between you and the fire, the expression "mind your beeswax," that's where that comes from, is, oh, your makeup is starting to melt. You ought to go take care of yourself. And that was a real problem. So they would want fireplace screens between they and the fireplace, and a tilt-top table could easily be one of those. So they could just tilt the top and then stick it between them and the fire, and that was their screen. There's some clues to age here. You see big screws, and so that gives you one idea about it. You also see down at the bottom here, there's they've covered up where there was a little repair here, and I'm guessing it was probably when it was made, actually, a piece split, because they put some little tiny nails and covered them up. So that gives us a little bit of a clue. And then the last thing I'm going to do, we look at the hardware, and we also look underneath at the way it's made. It's been repaired at one point. I would say that this probably dates to 1870, I would say, at the earliest, but not any newer than 1890. So you're late Victorian era. And the value on this, I mean, she got it for free, so you know you're in good shape. I would say probably $300 to $350 on this piece. Now, what I was looking for was to see whether it might have been all made by hand, in which case it might be older and a period piece of furniture might be more. But this one, I can tell that they use machines to do some of this cutting and the work. So that would be about our age.
Well, that's what we always wondered.
And how did you get this?
At a thrift store.
A thrift store. Okay, very good. Well, I love hearing people finding cool things at thrift stores, and I do think that this is actually a well done print. It is a print. You've got the name here, Walter Verley, and you are correct. This is a German painter, and I think worked in the early 1900s, if I remember correctly, and definitely known for these very sweet scenes, especially with the children. I like the ones reading the books here. Now, the frame looks really old until you look at the back. And that's where, I mean, the frame actually really looks old. It's very well done with the laurel leaf and the oak leaves and everything. It's very much everything you would expect in a Victorian frame until you turn it around. And when you turn it around and see the material they've used, it's actually some sort of a composite wood rather than solid wood. And so because of that, they did a good job making the frame look old, but it isn't terribly old. And the print is honestly probably not terribly old either. I suspect that these were, a lot of these things that were very popular, that were Victorian looking like this, were reproduced around 1980 when Victorian became really big again. And I think that's what you have is a piece from that era. Now, nonetheless, it's a nice frame, and you got it at a thrift store. Do you mind me asking how much? 20 bucks. Well, you did great for your price, because the frame is clearly worth double that. And I think if you had this and you put it in a store and represented it as what it is, which is a faithful recreation of a Victorian painting, it's not brand new, it has some age, I would think that you would probably price this maybe in the $100 range in a store. So I think the price you paid is very good. It's just not old yet.
This one I found at a thrift store in Quincy. It's just a blue picture with an Abbey on it or something. It's been chipped as well. But Melissa was with me when I bought this one, and she went, "Why do you want that?" I said, "Because it's blue."
It's blue, yep. What did you get for this one?
Oh, probably $5 to $8.
Oh, that's great. Well, okay, so first of all, you mentioned chips. The other one had cracks. This does have one chip here. Given the choice between having a chip or having a crack, what do you folks think would be better if you had to choose, a chip or a crack?
A chip.
Okay, most people are saying a chip. I hear a few saying a crack. Why do you say a chip?
Easier to repair.
Easier to repair. Also, it won't grow. So the important thing is keep the one that's got the crack away from extreme weather changes, like extreme heat. If you have it in a window, I'd put it somewhere away from the window, because cracks can grow, but a chip is just a chip and it won't get any bigger. I like this castle motif that looks European, but this is going to be an American piece again. We just like to put things on that seem very important and grand. And this would have been done probably about 1910. So it's a little newer than the other one, but not a whole lot. And I think the price you paid is great, because even with the chip, I would still expect this to be probably in the $35, $40 range. So $8 is a great price. Tell me a little about it and how you got it.
A friend gave it to me.
Oh, that's great.
And he was cleaning out his daddy's house. And there was a number of things in the house that belonged to help me get this right, to an old store.
Scarborough in Chattahoochee was a general store, but it was mostly a feed, seed, hardware, but like stores in the early 1900s,
they carried everything. The feed and seed store, even in the 1970s, I lived in a little town in Washington State. Dad he was late to work one day because their alarm clock broke overnight. And so we went to the hardware store to buy an alarm clock, because the hardware store was the variety store. That was it. That was all there was. This would have been the kind of thing they would have hung above a barrel so that you could scoop and put what you needed in. Out west, there's a store called Safeway. Safeway was called that because it was safe, because you didn't have to touch the stuff anymore. They started putting things in packages and things. And up until then, you went into the store, and if you needed a bunch of oats, they handed you this, and you went into the oat barrel and you scooped up what you needed and you threw it in a bag and you paid for it and you left. And so these things would have been hanging all around a general store of that sort around that time, which is early 1900s. I know you look at it and think, well, it's just basic and utilitarian, which it is, but that's part of what people like about this stuff now. A lot of people who are collecting, they want practical things. They want things that, or at least things that suggest the way things were and what people actually did. They're not necessarily wanting to look at a Tiffany chandelier. They're more interested in, how did people really live their lives? I think the value on this is probably around $45 or $50 because of the connection to the local area. The Egyptian dream book and fortune teller. Wow, that is quite lurid.
is that cool?
Oh, I like that a lot. Yes. She is reading the book and having some sort of a dream or learning her fortune. This is great. Someone who had a dream that the safe was open and silver was stolen. So she woke up and that she was concerned that her husband was not safe, and she arrived to find his warehouse in ashes and learned that he had died in the fire. How awful. So apparently this stuff works, so be careful. If you dream about beans, it denotes criticism and slander from an inferior. Yeah, beans. Birds, to catch them denotes pleasure and profit. To kill them means damage. To shoot them means undermining on the part of an enemy. Birds assembled together either mean a great talk or a lawsuit. Wow. I find this very fascinating. There was so much interest in the Victorian era. I mean, we think about them as being, very prim and church going and not believing in superstition, but oh no, it was not that way at all. I mean, they may have been prim and church going, but there was plenty of belief in superstition and wanting to understand things and have your fortune read and have your dreams analyzed and your handwriting analyzed and all of this stuff. A lot of people are just starting to reach a point of literacy to be able to buy books like this. There wasn't compulsory education, and there were lots of people who were very, very, very intelligent, but never had a formal education to be able to read something like this. So this was leisure time for the new middle class around the 1880s. And I just think it's a really interesting one. And because of the subject, it's more interesting than a lot of other Victorian books. We see little books of prose or Hiawatha by Longfellow over and over and over and over, but we don't see these very much, partly because it also was not considered terribly seemly. If the parson came around, you did not want him to see that you were reading to have your fortune told by some non-God inspired source. You don't see them very often. I think the value is probably around $20 in the condition it's in, because it's pretty worn and it does have the cracked spine. It could be rebound, but that would just be for personal choice. But I think it's an interesting subject. How did you get these things?
Used to go to a lot of antique auctions came in some lots we bought. I've got a lot of the old crock jugs.
Oh, yes. And then this piece here looks like it's pewter.
And that, I can't find anything on that.
Well, it's got one little mark on the bottom. Let's take a look at that and see if it tells us anything. Okay, it certainly does. It's a little hard to read, but I think that's a PD under there. And it's got a little mark right there.
Right.
And that appears to me to be an English pewter hallmark. The English were the first to really use pewter extensively, and so they hallmarked a lot of their early stuff, even as early as the late 1700s they were doing this. This piece looks more like probably a 19th century piece. It's not quite as heavy as the really early ones, but I suspect that this is 120 to 130 years old as far as your age goes. Pewter was very popular for a while because up until they came out with pewter, most people ate off of wood. They carved themselves a plate. They'd have to file it down. If it got splinters, they'd have to file it down again. And they'd use the same old wooden bowl for years and years and years until it finally fell apart. Well, then they figured out, aha, we can make things out of metal. I mean, there was already, of course, silver and gold for the very, very, very wealthy, but all of a sudden here was something that is priced where we can sell it to the middle class. And pewter is basically a composite of lead and tin and zinc and other lightweight materials, which is why I recommend you don't actually use it.
Just to sit up on a shelf.
That's the thing to do with pewter. Either use it to put on the shelf or use it to put a flower arrangement in it, but it often has lead in it, so I don't recommend using it on the table. I think the value on this one in this condition, $50 to $75 these days. Pewter used to sell for about double that, and I think it's going to start making a comeback soon because the painting on interiors is all going to grays, and pewter looks good with gray, and I think that'll kick people into it again. This one is actually a little older than it looks. It's got a number 14 on the bottom, and that's just a stock number. It was to make sure that they got the right parts together, because you notice the wing and the foot is a separate part, the way it moves. So they wanted to make sure they put the right legs on the right body, so that's why those are there. These appear to be stamped in India. The detail is pretty good. They could be 1950s, but they could be as early as 1930s as well. They don't have any mark with country of origin, so they may not have been meant to be exported, or they may have gone to England. England for a while would make them put made in British India. That was right when the people in India were trying to separate, and so they would do that to remind them that you're still part of us until they weren't anymore. But I don't see that mark, and so that's why I think either 30s or 50s, not 1940. This last couple of years, there is a real interest in brass again. Brass has really come back. Brass furniture is popular again, and they actually prefer this where it's a little dull. They don't want it shiny bright. Because shiny bright looks new and they want stuff that looks old, and these are old now. I would say that the value on the pair of these, because there's interest again, I would think in the right hands you might see $35 on a set like this, which I imagine since you got them at the flea market you probably came out. So a lot of these small town museums end up being teaching opportunities for school kids. So for example, here's all the things you would have needed: hames for the horse, pulleys for the hay barn. And here they are where they can actually see how this was done. There's some really neat stuff in here. For example, they show an antique pressing iron. This is pretty cool. 15 pounds, can you believe? Made in Minnesota. And this was, well, you didn't have electricity, so you had to have the gas with you. That way, this big, heavy tailor's iron could do its work. Whole bunch of different things here, everything from pig rings, which you would have used, because even a small place like this would have probably had pigs or goats or chickens or all of those for food and to provide milk and cheese and eggs and that sort of thing. I think this is such a great idea.
It was just storage. It was you would not believe what it looked like. A mess. Piles of wood, trash. We had lots of stuff at our house, and a lot of the stuff came from our house. Tried to find as many as you could that might have to do with Florida.
Yes, I see that with the Dixie salmon and the Florida potatoes. People don't know that they grow potatoes here. Now this board is kind of interesting. This has a bunch of advertising. This is an old game table.
And it's from the city of Quincy, if I'm not mistaken. And these are businesses around the around the square.
Fun and Games, year-round Toyland, Manning Taylor Chevrolet, right? So they sponsored this, and then
This came from Chamber of Commerce, I believe.
Oh, that makes sense. That's why, because they figured you'd sit and play their games and then support their businesses. Neat. The old cash register is cool. Is that out of a local store?
You heard Jane talking about the Scarborough store?
Yes, the Scarborough
She
store.
went to an event in Chattahoochee. There was a lady that had stuff that they had ended up with the stuff from Scarborough store. This thing came from them too. The paper.
Boy, and that is one heck of an industrial cheese cutter there.
I don't know. I think this came from a little country store in Gretna, Florida.
Gretna, which is kind of just a few miles down the road, isn't it?
I used to work one of these when my first job off the farm was at a grocery store.
Oh, how cool.
It's 60 cents an hour.
I'm pleased to see you folks putting this together, because so many little towns like this, if there isn't an active group taking an interest, this stuff just gets scattered and lost and is gone.
This little girl right here.
Oh, wow.
And that was her grandparents' store in Hardaway.
Oh, okay, which is another community just the other direction a few miles, right. Look, you can see things in this picture that still exist. Like that chair right there. Oh, this is from the Gretna store also, so this is a local rack. That's neat. You know, those racks are pretty valuable now. That's
heavy.
Very heavy. Yeah, because that's tubular iron from the 30s. Right. Yeah. Yeah, this is 1920s or 30s. 25 cents for a carton plus deposit. See, they had bottle deposit back then too. You said this came from an antique auction also?
Right, and I just, for a while, I was buying all the clock pictures that came through an auction. I have quite a few.
Oh, I think they're just great. And where I am up in Kentucky, when I'm up in that part of the country, they love this stuff up there. And it's probably more popular and more valuable there than almost anywhere.
We used to buy a lot over in Alabama from somebody that was hauling from up north.
From up north, yeah. A lot of this seems like it came from Midwestern ceramic companies, although there were a lot in the Carolinas as well. Florida wouldn't have had a lot of this in the early days because there weren't enough people really to justify making it, so they would have brought it in elsewhere. Well, it's redware, which is a specific type of clay, so it's got this red base, and the glaze over it is what they call a salt glaze. This would have been because they had salt in the glaze, and it gives it this sheen, and that was to keep it, and you notice they did it inside and out because that way it will not leak. And so this one's in really good condition. There's no chips or cracks or breaks. You can tell it was handmade. You can even tell that they just sort of, they made the handle and then they had to apply it, and they used a tool that had a little diamond in it. So that's where you get that mark. There's nothing that's going to tell us which of the many, 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 many companies making this was, but I do think you're looking at a Midwest piece, 1880s approximately. And, you know, value on this in the right place is probably 135, maybe more if you had it in New England in a store devoted to primitives, that sort of thing.
I probably paid $25 because that's about what I was paying.
Oh, that's great. Well, I think you did very well on that one. You know, the price I gave you is I'm putting it in a fancy store devoted to primitives and waiting for that customer price, but somebody could get that price for it.
This is probably going into my estate sale, my children.
Well,
You should put a little note in it.
Yeah, you might put a little note in it. The other thing that's nice about this, if you look at the inside, is you can see that it's hand thrown because you can see the lines. This was too big a piece for them to just do without a pottery wheel, so it spun on a pottery wheel a little bit, and you see that linear design inside, so, and on the outside if you look.
It's just like the roadside antique shop.
That's right. It is a lot like that. So when you said these came from Mexico, tell me about that.
The gentleman that I take care of, which I've been living with him for 22 years now, and they're just sitting around the house. And so when I did some cleaning, I had put down some new floors, and I took those down. So I had writing on the back and everything, so I'm not sure.
Well, on the back it says The Nest by Francois Boucher, and what it is that you notice it says Sunshine Biscuits on here. This is the lid for a biscuit tin.
Okay.
And there was a whole series of these, and so yeah, there were probably 6 or 8 different artists, and what they did is they took famous art from a much earlier time. These pieces were painted in the 1700s, but this was done probably in the late 60s. They did these as a thing to get people to buy more of the crackers and biscuits. And so they'd have a different lid on each one so that you would hopefully get the whole bunch. And the idea was that you would do just what this person did, which is to put something on the back and hang it on the wall. Exactly, as art. Exactly. So it's a tin lid. It's a biscuit tin lid. Exactly. And as a hanging piece, I would say if you saw this in a store, you'd probably see it priced about $20.
I love that right there.
Oh, I do too. The sheep and the lambs. It's so nicely done. The French are just really, the French painters, I mean, they were so good with the realism. And, you know, I look at it now and think, oh yeah, well, you could just see that in a picture, but that's because we live in the time of pictures. Think about when you didn't see anything unless somebody made a painting and they had to sit there for hours and hours and hours and hours. What the biscuit company did is they went to a bunch of museums and said, we would like the rights to produce this on the tin. And they did it using what they call tin lithography.
We'll have more appraisals coming up soon, but right now we wanted to take a look at some displays that honor some of the people who left a legacy behind.
These smaller town displays give tribute to people from a local area who might be forgotten otherwise. These are World War I veterans. This is far enough back in time that none of these folks are still with us today. But the World War I veterans put together these items. Now, the Japanese Zero flag is Second World War, but the piece that you see here is actually from the Japo-Prussian War from about 1908. You see the chrysanthemum on the handle. These were swords for the infantry that were then distributed to almost everybody in Japan, anticipating that we were going to invade them. Instead, of course, the atomic bomb happened and that ended the war. So we then confiscated a whole lot of these swords, and that's why we see them in museums in the United States. Then up top we have a plan of a French city from the First World War. This is a local lady who took in these 2 boys who were orphaned because their father was killed during the war. Speaking of the Second World War, this also came back with the servicemen after the war. This is in kimono with obi. The obi is the big sash, the fabric piece you see hanging to the right. This is a 1930s or 40s kimono, and you can tell partly by the softness of the design, it has almost an airbrush quality. Also, the materials used are a little different than the later kimono because they're all natural materials. The McClellan saddle, this was used by the military in the First World War. My grandfather was an infantryman and they actually used these types of saddles. It's very basic with the hole in the middle because it's going to be ridden hard. It needed to be lightweight and very durable. This one was restored and is on loan to the museum. One nice thing also is that local folks are able to loan things, and that way their story can be told in these museums as well.
This last appraisal ends up with a very important railroad ledger, which leads into a wonderful railroad museum in this town. Let's take a look.
This Apalachicola Northern Railroad is a railroad just a few hundred feet west of
Yeah, this is the railroad that brought the town here, right?
Right. And our group saved and restored the last railroad depot, Greensboro depot.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's what's on your shirt.
That's right. And this is a book that this railroad kept of the expenses month by month of about a 10-year period, divided up by the 4 railroads that went through that property: the Seaboard Airline, the
Louisville and Nashville, Atlantic Coast,
and the Apalachicola Northern, by the number of cars that went through.
So they handled about 7,000 cars that year. That's pretty impressive.
Yes.
That's actually a lot of business. You know, we forget how the railroad was everything. I mean, everything had to come and go by. I knew that there was a railroad heritage here. I did not realize that there was, until today, when I met all you folks, that Apalachicola Northern was a small short line of its own. And that's really fascinating, especially because you're kind of in the middle of it. And the short lines were important because they, you know, like you see, they're dealing with 3 other railroads, and they are the reason that those railroads are able to do business in this area at the time. The big railroads they'd build the main line and just keep going because they didn't have time to develop the branch lines and get the little towns involved. They didn't see the money in it. So someone else had to do it locally. Do you know when Apalachicola Northern was started? Was that around 07? Okay. Yeah. So it took about 5 years to get this far. Looks like it cost $119 to have 37 hours worth of people working and fixing a rail line. The handwriting is very neat. Well, you had to have good handwriting to get a job like this because they figured you had to be able to do bookkeeping and accounting and all this. There's going to be a value here, and then there's going to be a value that a railroad collector would give. So the greatest value is here as a historical document, of course, because this is something that is specific to local interest and specific to this town, this historic society. There are a lot of railroad fans who like this sort of thing, and they especially like when you are getting something that's from a smaller and relatively obscure line. And a railroad buff for this ledger, because it's an obscure line and it's pretty detailed, I'm guessing you might see $200 to $250 for that interest, but you couldn't replace it in terms of local historic interest for anything like that. I am so impressed that this group of people who are essentially working with zero funds and as volunteers have managed to put together the most important historic house in town and restore the depot. This was the Apalachicola Northern's Greensboro depot, and this was built and the town developed around it. 12 miles from River Junction and 89 miles from Port St. Joe, which is a big lumber facility, but was going to be a big port at one time. You see the old waiting bench. This one said this was in the new Monticello depot. Monticello is another town here in the Florida Panhandle. Wow, here we go. Yeah. Got some local railroad history in this one. And the doodlebug was your trade. Aw, how cute.
That came much later in the late 40s, I think.
Yep, it says 51 was the last trip.
Yeah. Towns along the Apalachicola Northern, there's Greensboro, River Junction, Hardaway. That was the depot in Chattahoochee at River Junction. Juniper, all of these towns are now gone. All of them are gone except for
Wow, Greensboro is the only one of the Appalachian Northern towns that survived. Tie date nails. This is something people don't always realize. These numbers are actually to let you know how long the railroad tie has been set there so that they would know when it was time to replace them, because they don't always tell us when they're about to break. Here's some of the old timetables. How long did this run? Did they eventually merge? It still runs as a separate road? Wow.
It's the Apalachicola Northern Railroad.
That's fantastic.
It's now owned by Jesse Lone.
Inspector's lantern. We see these a lot, and you see this one has the ruby globe, which is a little bit different. And this is for hand signals. That one's from the Erie Road. But we've got a whole bunch of our related lines here. All of this stuff is very collectible, of course. Railroad collectors love this. So, yep, the baggage and everything would have come through here. Baggage as well as freight, I imagine, because this was a small enough.
We had two separate trains in the beginning, a freight train and a passenger train.
Oh, okay. They didn't run them together. Some little towns, they pushed them all together and you had to sit behind the milk car or the goats or whatever they were taking.
This was the stationmaster's.
Oh, look at the old Railway Express Agency safe.
This is the original one to this depot. This dash came from River Junction. This came from Port St. Joe, which is where the railroad ultimately ended.
Right, that was their big port because they had Port St. Joe always has this feel of seeming like it should be a bigger place, yes, and I imagine it was. Yeah,
it was a huge place. This came out of the shop, as did all the tools that are in the baggage room.
Oh yes, I saw the big tools that were hanging up there. Boy, and these cabinets are very valuable now. I'm glad you were able to save that. Yeah. There was a time people were throwing this away because everything was going to be on the computer and we'd never need paper again. Well, guess what?
That's the bell.
Aw, how neat. This is the big old steam bell. Wow. And you know, the funny thing is I gave you a price on it, not thinking about the fact that because it's from a short line railroad and it's probably the only one left in existence, you might be able to tag a 20 or 30% premium over the price I told you, which I think I told you somewhere in the 2,000, 2,200 range. So, you know, you might be looking over 3,000 for that. Trainman's lanterns. It's neat to see what the different lanterns were for, because we run into these out in the field a lot and people just say lantern, but they all had different functions and they were made with these different cages and different ways the light would project depending on what the function was. And then we've got our telegraph keys, because of course this was also the center of all of the communications in the area. And there is our brass steam whistle, and it's a little smaller than I thought, but boy, that is a fantastic piece. Oh, there we go. That's what I thought when we were talking. Okay, we got the little babies here.
Right. This is from 150. It was a 460.
It's a 460. Now I'm seeing it. Yep, there we go. Oh, that's right, because there's two sets in front. Yeah, okay, so we've got 4, 6, and then no trailing wheels under the cab. Got it. Very neat. And they've got all the specs from having it put together.
This building had been sold to a private individual family that turned it into a barber shop. And so it didn't have anything like this. But we knew it was the original structure.
Yes.
And so we started investigating, found the plans for the Apalachicola Northern Railroad Depot.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you were able to save the structure and put it back to the rooms the way they had it. You noticed when I showed from the outside that there were 2 exterior doors, and that's because in the old days, there would have had to have been a colored waiting room and a white waiting room. And you notice the size and scale are about the same. And in a small town depot, they probably essentially were equivalent services. Whereas in some of the bigger city depots, you would have seen a real difference in the quality between one and the other. And you notice that they have 2 clocks. Why is that? Because the Chattahoochee River, which is very close to here, is the dividing between Eastern and Central Time. They've actually built a small building behind it that is a meeting center, and they do rent these buildings out as event centers, which I think is pretty smart because, again, they are self-funding. Well, it's always so great to be able to support what other people are doing in terms of historic preservation, and just the fact that they really like and think that these things are worth having for future generations to see. It just does my heart good. And, you know, museums make history a lot more interesting if you can come and touch and see and feel and be hands-on, and at a museum like this, you can.
If you enjoyed this video, check out this one. Also, click thumbs up to like this video, and check the description for information about our Patreon, our memberships. We've got a lot of different levels with different perks and bonus videos and early content. Also, please do check out our website, theantiquenomad.com, for appraisal help, and we'll see you again for more adventures in the antique and vintage community soon. Bye for now.